Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from the Arabian Nights, and we're reading the story of Sinbad the Sailor. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there dwelt in Baghdad a poor porter named Hindbad, who often had to carry heavy burdens which he could scarcely support. One very hot day he was laboring along a strange street, and overcome by fatigue, he sat down near a great house to rest. The porter complimented himself upon his good fortune in finding such a pleasant place, for while he sat there reached his ears sweet sounds of music, and his senses were also soothed by sweet smells. Wondering who lived in so fine a house, he inquired of one of the servants. "What," said the man, "do you not know that Sinbad the sailor, the famous voyager, who has sailed around the world, lives here?" "Alas," replied Hindbad, "what a difference there is between Sinbad's lot and mine! Yet what greater merit does he possess that he should prosper, and I starve?" Now Sinbad happened to overhear this remark, and anxious to see a man who expressed such strange views, he sent for Hindbad. Accordingly, Hindbad was led into the great hall, where there was a sumptuous repast spread and a goodly company assembled. The poor porter felt very uncomfortable until Sinbad bade him draw near, and seating him at his right hand, gave him food and drink, serving him himself. When the repast was over, Sinbad asked him why he complained of his condition. "My lord," replied Hindbad, "I confess that my fatigue put me out of humor and occasioned me to utter some indiscreet words, which I beg you to pardon." "Do not think I am so unjust," resumed Sinbad, "as to resent such a complaint, but that you may know that my wealth has not been gained without labor, I recite the history of my travels for your benefit, and I think that when you have heard it, you will acknowledge how wonderful have been my adventures." Sinbad then related the story of his first voyage as follows. The first voyage. When still a very young man, I inherited a large fortune from my father and at once set about amusing myself. I lived luxuriously and soon found that money was decreasing, while nothing was added to replace the expenditure. Quickly seeing the folly of my ways, I invested the remainder of my fortune with some merchants of Bussorah and joined them in their voyage, which was toward the Indies by way of the Persian Gulf. In our voyage, we touched at several islands, where we sold or exchanged our goods. One day, whilst under sail, we were becalmed near a small island, but little elevated above the level of the water and resembling a green meadow. The captain ordered his sails to be furled and permitted such persons as were so inclined to land. Of this number I was one. But while we were enjoying ourselves in eating and drinking and recovering ourselves from the fatigue of the sea, the island on a sudden trembled and shook us terribly. The trembling of the island was perceived on board the ship, and we were called upon to re-embark speedily, or we should all be lost, for what we took for an island proved to be the back of a sea monster. The nimblest got into the sloop, others betook themselves to swimming, but for myself I was still upon the back of the creature when he dived into the sea, and I had time only to catch hold of a piece of wood that we had brought out of the ship to make a fire. Meanwhile, the captain, having received those on board who were in the sloop, and taken up some of those that swam, resolved to improve the favorable gale that had just risen, and hoisting his sails, pursued his voyage, so that it was impossible for me to recover the ship. Thus was I exposed to the mercy of the waves. I struggled for my life all the rest of the day and the following night. By this time I found my strength gone, and despaired of saving my life, when happily a wave threw me against an island. I struggled up the steep bank by aid of some roots, and lay down upon the ground half dead until the sun appeared. Then, though I was very feeble, both from hard labor and want of food, I crept along to find some herbs fit to eat, and had the good luck not only to procure some, but likewise to discover a spring of excellent water, which contributed much to recover me. As I advanced farther into the island, I was not a little surprised and startled to hear a voice and see a man who asked me who I was. I related to him my adventure, after which, taking me by the hand, he led me into a cave, where there were several other people no less amazed to see me than I was to see them. I partook of some provisions which they offered me. I then asked them what they did in such a desert place, to which they answered that they were grooms belonging to the Maharaja, sovereign of the island, and that they were about to lead the king's horses back to the palace. They added that they were to return home on the morrow, and had I been one day later, I must have perished, because the inhabited part of the island was at a great distance, and it would have been impossible for me to have got thither without a guide. When the grooms set out, I accompanied them, and was duly presented to the Maharaja, who was much interested in my adventure, and bade me stay with him as long as I desired. Being a merchant, I met with men of my own profession, and particularly inquired for those who were strangers, that perchance I might hear news from Baghdad, or find an opportunity to return, for the Maharaja's capital is situated on the sea-coast and has a fine harbor, where ships arrive daily from the different quarters of the world. I frequented also the society of the learned Indians and took delight in hearing them converse. But withal, I took care to make my court regularly to the Maharaja, and conversed with the governors and petty kings, his tributaries, that were about him. They put 1,000 questions respecting my country, and I, being willing to inform myself as to their laws and customs, asked them concerning everything which I thought worth knowing. One day, as I was at the port, the ship in which I had set sail arrived, and the crew began to unload the goods. I saw my own bales with my name upon them, and going up to the captain said, "I am that Sinbad, whom you thought to be dead, and those bales are mine." When the captain heard me speak thus, "Heavens," he exclaimed, "whom can we trust in these times? There is no faith left among men. I saw Sinbad perish with my own eyes, as did also the passengers on board, and yet you tell me you are that Sinbad. What impudence is this? To look on you, one would take you to be a man of honesty, and yet you tell a horrible falsehood in order to possess yourself of what does not belong to you." "Nevertheless, I am Sinbad the sailor," I insisted. "You must believe me. I speak nothing but the truth." I spoke earnestly, and brought to his remembrance a number of things that had happened on our voyage with the merchants of Bussorah. After much discussion, the captain was convinced of the truth of my words, and having seen me identified by members of the crew, he handed me over my goods, congratulating me upon my escape. I took out what was most valuable in my bales and presented them to the Maharaja, who, knowing my misfortune, asked me how I came by such rarities. I acquainted him with the circumstance of their recovery. Excuse me. He was pleased at my good luck, accepted my present, and in return gave me one much more considerable. Upon this I took leave of him and went aboard the same ship after I had exchanged my goods for the commodities of that country. We passed by several islands, and at last arrived at Bussorah, from whence I came to this city with goods which I sold for 100,000 sequins. Sinbad stopped here and ordered the musicians to proceed with their concert, which the story had interrupted. The company continued enjoying themselves till the evening, and it was time to retire when Sinbad sent for a purse of 100 sequins, and giving it to the porter, said, "Take this, Sinbad, return to your home, and come back tomorrow to hear more of my adventures." The porter went away, astonished at the honor done and the present made him. Arrayed in his best apparel, he returned to Sinbad's house next day and was welcomed heartily. When all the guests had arrived, dinner was served, and after dinner, Sinbad, addressing himself to the company, said, "Gentlemen, be pleased to listen to the adventures of my second voyage. They deserve your attention even more than those of my first voyage." Upon which everyone held his peace, and Sinbad proceeded with his narrative. The second voyage of Sinbad. I intended, after my first voyage, to spend the rest of my days at Baghdad, but it was not long ere I grew weary of a quiet life, and therefore I set out a second time upon a voyage. We embarked on board a good ship and set sail. We traded from island to island and exchanged commodities with great profit. One day we landed at an island covered with several sorts of fruit trees, but we could see neither man nor animal. We went to take a little fresh air in the meadows along the streams that watered them. While some diverted themselves with gathering flowers and other fruits, I took my wine and provisions and sat down near a stream betwixt two high trees which formed a thick shade. I made a good meal and afterwards fell asleep. I cannot tell how long I slept, but when I awoke, the ship was gone. I regretted not being content with the produce of my first voyage that might have sufficed me all my life. But all this was in vain, and my repentance too late. Not knowing what to do, I climbed up to the top of a lofty tree, whence I looked about on all sides to see if I could discover anything that could give me hopes. When I gazed over the land, I beheld something white, and coming down, I took what provisions I had left and went toward it, the distance being so great that I could not distinguish what it was. As I approached, I thought it to be a white dome of a great height and extent, and when I came up to it, I touched it and found it to be very smooth. I went around to see if it was open on any side, but saw it was not, and that there was no climbing up to the top, as it was so smooth. It was at least 50 paces round. By this time the sun was about to be set, and all of a sudden the sky became dark as if it had been covered with a thick cloud. I was much astonished at this sudden darkness, but much more when I found it occasioned by a bird of monstrous size that came flying toward me. I remembered that I had often heard mariners speak of a miraculous bird called a roc, and conceived that the great dome which I so much admired must be its egg. In a short time the bird alighted and sat over the egg. As I perceived her coming, I crept close to the egg, so that I had before me one of the legs of the bird, which was as big as the trunk of a tree. I tied myself strongly to it with my turban in hopes that the roc next morning would carry me with her out of this desert island. After having passed the night in this condition, the bird flew away as soon as it was daylight, and carried me so high that I could not discern the earth. She afterwards descended with so much rapidity that I lost my senses, but when I found myself on the ground, I speedily untied the knot, and had scarcely done so when the roc, having taken up a serpent of great length in her bill, flew away. The spot where it left me was encompassed on all sides by mountains that seemed to reach above the clouds, and so steep that there was no possibility of getting out of the valley. This was a new perplexity, so that when I compared this place with the desert island from which the roc had brought me, I found that I had gained nothing by the change. As I walked through this valley, I perceived it was strewn with diamonds, some of which were of a surprising size. I took pleasure in looking upon them, but shortly saw at a distance some objects that greatly diminished my satisfaction, and which I could not view without terror, namely, a great number of serpents so monstrous that the least of them was capable of swallowing an elephant. They retired in the daytime to their dens, where they hid themselves from the roc, their enemy, and came out only in the night. I spent the day in walking about in the valley, resting myself at times in such places as I thought most convenient. When night came on, I went into a cave and secured the entrance, which was low and narrow, with a great stone to preserve me from the serpents, but not so far as to exclude the light. I supped on part of my provisions, but the serpents, which began hissing around me, put me into such extreme fear that you may easily imagine I did not sleep. When day appeared, the serpents retired, and I came out of the cave trembling. I can justly say that I walked upon diamonds without feeling any inclination to touch them. At last I sat down, and notwithstanding my apprehensions, not having closed my eyes during the night, fell asleep, after having eaten a little more of my provisions. But I had scarcely shut my eyes when something that fell by me with a great noise awakened me. This was a large piece of raw meat, and at the same time I saw several others fall down from the rocks in different places. I had always regarded as fabulous what I had heard sailors and others relate of the Valley of Diamonds, and of the means employed by merchants to obtain jewels from thence. But now I found that they had stated nothing but the truth. For as a fact, the merchants come to this valley when the eagles have young ones, and throwing great joints of meat into the valley, the diamonds upon whose points they fall stick to them. And eagles, which are stronger in this country than anywhere else, pounce with great force upon those pieces of meat and carry them to their nests on the precipices of the rock to feed their young. The merchants at this time run to their nests, disturb and drive off the eagles by their shouts, and take away the diamonds that stick to the meat. The happy idea struck me that here was a means of escape from my living tomb. So I collected a number of the largest diamonds and put them into the leather bag in which I used to carry my provisions, and which I tied to my girdle. Then I fastened one of the joints of meat to the middle of my back by means of my turban cloth, and lay down with my face to the ground. I had scarcely placed myself in this posture when the eagles came. Each of them seized a piece of meat, and one of the strongest, having taken me up with the piece of meat to which I was fastened, carried me to his nest on top of the mountain. The merchants began their shouting to frighten the eagles, and when they had obliged them to quit their prey, one of them came to the nest where I was. He was much alarmed when he saw me, but recovering himself, instead of inquiring how I came thither, began to quarrel with me and ask why I stole his goods. "You will treat me," replied I, "with more civility when you know me better. Do not be uneasy. I have diamonds enough for you and myself, more than all the other merchants together. Whatever they have, they owe to chance, but I selected for myself in the bottom of the valley those which you see in this bag." I had scarcely done speaking when the other merchants came crowding about us, much astonished to see me, but they were much more surprised when I told them my story. They conducted me to their encampment, and there, having opened my bag, they were surprised at the largeness of my diamonds, and confessed that in all the courts which they had visited they had never seen any of such size and perfection. I prayed the merchant who owned the nest to which I had been carried, for every merchant had his own, to take as many for his share as he pleased. He contented himself with one, and that too the least of them. I pressed him to take more. "No," said he, "I am very well satisfied with this, which is valuable enough to save me the trouble of making any more voyages, and will raise as great a fortune as I desire." I spent the night with the merchants, to whom I related my story a second time, for the satisfaction of those who had not heard it. I could not moderate my joy when I found myself delivered from the danger I have mentioned. I thought myself in a dream, and could scarcely believe myself out of danger. When at length I reached home, I gave large presents to the poor, and lived luxuriously upon my hard-earned wealth. Thus Sinbad ended the account of his second voyage, and having given Hindbad another 100 sequins, asked him to come on the next day to hear his further adventures. The third voyage of Sinbad. I soon resolved upon a third voyage, and once more took ship at Bussorah. After we had been at sea a few weeks, we were overtaken by a dreadful storm, and were obliged to cast anchor near an island which the captain had endeavored to avoid, for he assured us that it was inhabited by pygmy savages, covered with hair, who would speedily attack us in great numbers. Soon an innumerable multitude of frightful savages about 2 feet high boarded the ship. Resistance was useless. They took down our sails, cut our cable, towed the ship to land, and made us all go on shore. We went towards the interior of the island and discovered a large building. It was a lofty palace having a gate of ebony, which we pushed open, and soon discovered a room in which were human bones and roasting spits. Presently there appeared a hideous black man, who was as tall as a palm tree. He had but one eye, his teeth were long and sharp, and his nails like the talons of a bird. He took me up as I would a kitten, but finding I was little better than skin and bone, put me down with contempt. The captain, being the fattest of the party, was sacrificed to his appetite. When the monster had finished his meal, he stretched himself upon a great stone bench in the portico and fell asleep, snoring louder than thunder. In this manner he slept till morning. In the morning he went out. I said to my companions, "Do not waste time in useless sorrow. Let us hurry to look for timber to make rafts." We found some timber on the seashore and labored hard, but having no tools, it was evening before we had finished. And while we were on the point of pushing the raft off the beach, our hideous tyrant returned and drove us to his palace as if we had been a flock of sheep. We saw another of our companions sacrificed, and the giant lay down to sleep as before. Our desperate condition gave us courage. 9 of us got up very softly and held the points of the roasting spits in the fire until we made them red hot. Then we thrust them at once into the monster's eye. He uttered a frightful scream, and having tried in vain to find us, opened the ebony gate and left the palace. We did not stay long behind him, but ran to the seashore, got our rafts ready, and waited for daylight to embark. But at dawn we beheld our monstrous enemy, led by 2 giants of equal size, and followed by many others. We jumped upon our rafts and pushed them from the shore, the tide helping us. The giants, seeing us likely to escape, tore great pieces of rock, and wading in the water up to their waists, hurled them at us with all their might. They sank every one of the rafts, but that on which I was. Thus all my companions, except 2, were drowned. We rowed as fast as we could and got out of reach of these monsters. We were at sea 2 days, but at last found a pleasant island. After eating some fruit, we lay down to sleep, but were soon awakened by the hissing of an enormous serpent. One of my comrades was instantly devoured by this terrific creature. I climbed up a tree as fast as I could, and reached the topmost branches. My remaining companion was following me, but the dreadful reptile entwined itself round the tree and caught him. The serpent then went down and glided away. I waited until late the next day before I ventured to descend. Evening again approached, and I gathered together a great quantity of small wood, brambles, and thorns. Having made them into faggots, I formed a circle round the tree and fastened the uppermost to the branches of the tree. I then climbed up to the highest branches. At night the serpent came again, but could not reach the tree, and crawling vainly round and round my little fortification until daylight, he went away. The next day I spied a ship in full sail a long way off. With the linen of my turban I made a signal, which was perceived. I was taken on board the ship, and there told the strange story of my adventures. The captain was very kind to me. He said that he had some bales of goods which had belonged to a merchant who had unintentionally left him some time ago on an uninhabited island. As this man was undoubtedly dead, he intended to sell the goods for the benefit of his relatives, and I should have the profit of selling them. I now recollected that this was the captain with whom I sailed on my second voyage. I soon convinced him that I was really Sinbad, whom he supposed to have been lost. He was delighted at the discovery, and eagerly acknowledged that the property was mine. I continued my voyage, sold my goods to great advantage, and returned to Baghdad. Having thus finished the account of his 3rd voyage, Sinbad sent Hindbad on his way after he had given him another 100 sequins, and invited him to dinner the next day to hear the continuation of his adventures. The 4th voyage of Sinbad. My desire of seeing foreign countries rendered my pleasures at home unsatisfactory. I therefore arranged my affairs, commenced a voyage to Persia, and having bought a large stock of goods, loaded a ship and again embarked. The ship struck upon a rock, and the cargo was lost. A few others and myself were borne by the current to an island on which we were surrounded by black savages and carried to their huts. The savages offered us herbs. My companions eagerly took them, for they were hungry. Grief would not allow me to eat, and presently I saw that the herbs had made my comrades senseless. Rice, mixed with oil of coconuts, was then offered to us. which my companions ate greedily and grew fat. My unhappy friends were then devoured one after another, having become appetizing to the cannibals. But I languished so much that they did not think me fit to eat. They left me to the care of an old man from whom I managed to escape. He called to me as loud as he could to return, but I redoubled my speed, and taking care to go a contrary way from that which the savages had taken, I never stopped till night. At the end of 7 days, on the seashore, I found a number of white persons gathering pepper. They asked me in Arabic who I was and whence I came, and I gave them an account of the shipwreck and of my escape. They treated me kindly and presented me to their king, who treated me with great liberality. During my stay with them, I observed that when the king and his nobles went hunting, they rode their horses without bridle or saddle. With the assistance of some workmen, I made a bridle and saddle, and having put them upon one of the king's horses, presented the animal thus equipped to his majesty. He was so delighted that he instantly mounted and rode about the grounds almost the whole day. All the ministers of state and the nobility induced me to make saddles and bridles for them, for which they made me such magnificent presents that I soon became very rich. The king at last requested that I would marry and become one of his nation. From a variety of circumstances I could not refuse, and he therefore gave me one of the ladies of his court, who was young, rich, beautiful, and virtuous. We lived in the great harmony in a palace belonging to my wife. I had made a good friend of a very worthy man who lived in this place. Hearing one day that his wife had just died, I went to condole with him on this unexpected calamity. We were alone together, and he appeared to be in the deepest grief. After I had talked with him some time on the uselessness of so much sorrow, he told me that it was an established law that the living husband should be buried with the deceased wife, and that within an hour he must submit. I shuddered at the dreadful custom. In a short time, the woman was attired in her most costly dress and jewels, and placed in an open coffin. The procession then began, the husband following the corpse. They ascended to the top of an exceedingly high mountain, and a great stone was removed, which covered the mouth of a deep pit. The corpse was let down, and the husband, having taken leave of his friends, was put into another open coffin with a pot of water and 7 small loaves, and he was let down. The stone was replaced, and they all returned. The horror of this was still fresh upon my mind when my wife fell sick and died. The king and the whole court, out of respect to me, instantly prepared to assist at a similar ceremony with me. I restrained the feeling of despair until we arrived at the top of the mountain, when I fell at the feet of the king and begged him to spare my life. All I said was ineffectual, and after my wife was let down, I also was put into the deep pit, everyone being totally indifferent to my cries and lamentations. I made the cave echo with my vain complaints. I lived some days on the bread and water which had been put into my coffin, but the supply was at length exhausted. I then wandered to a remote part of this frightful cave, and lay down to prepare for death. I was thus wishing only for a speedy termination of my misery, when I heard something walking and panting. I started up, upon which the thing panted still more, and then ran away. I pursued it, and sometimes it seemed to stop, but on my approach continued to go on before me. I pursued it until at last I saw a glimmering light like a star. This redoubled my eagerness until at last I discovered a hole large enough to allow my escape. I crept through the aperture and found myself on the seashore, and discovered that the creature was a sea monster, which had been accustomed to enter at that hole to feed upon the dead bodies. Having eaten some shellfish, I returned to the cave, where I collected all the jewels I could find in the dark. These I carried to the seashore and tied them up very neatly into bales with the cords that let down the coffins. I laid them on the beach, waiting till some ship should pass. In 2 days, a ship came out of the harbor and passed by that part of the coast. I made a signal, and a boat took me on board. I was obliged to say that I had been wrecked, for had they known my real story, I should have been carried back, as the captain was a native of this country. We touched at several islands, and at the port of Kela, where I found a ship ready to sail for Bassorah, and having presented some jewels to the captain who had brought me to Kela, I sailed and at last arrived at Baghdad. Sinbad then presented another 100 sequins to the porter, and bade him honor him with his presence again the next day. I believe we will stop there, because we have 3 more voyages of Sinbad, so I'll continue with them next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.